Greetings and welcome to Freedom News, or Frihetsnytt as we say in Sweden. The focus of today's interview will be the so-called Defense Cooperation Agreement between Sweden and the United States of America. The proponents, they claim it is vital for the Swedish security by handing over 17 military bases to the American military, while the critics compares it to a full-scale military occupation. With us here today to give his expert opinion on this is none other than Colonel Douglas Macgregor, all the way with us from the United States of America. Welcome, Colonel. It's a very great pleasure and a great honor to have you with us here today.
Happy to be with you.
I think most of our viewers are already familiar with you and the work you do. But in case we have some new people with us here today, could you just give a very brief introduction to who you are?
I spent 28 years in the regular Army of the United States after graduating from West Point in June 1976. I served primarily in combat formations, for the most part, what we call armored cavalry. I then also spent a couple of years in graduate school, earned a master's and a PhD in international relations. I studied in Europe as a young man. I studied in Germany. I went to a gymnasium in the 11th grade. I spent my 11th grade year there. So I subsequently ended up spending almost 8 years of my life in Germany. And then 2 years at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, where I was the director of the Joint Operations Center for the Kosovo Air Campaign. So I've certainly got a lot of experience in Bosnia-Herzegovina and as well as in Belgium. And of course, I'm probably best known for the Battle of 73 Easting, which was a large tank battle in the last 24 to 36 hours of the Gulf War in 1991. And I was more recently the senior military advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense for President Trump.
That's a very amazing resume that you have given us, and it really proves that you are the real expert that we need to get a comment on this agreement. But when you hear about this so-called DCAA, that Sweden is giving away 17 military bases to the United States, that the personnel, both the military but also civilian visitors, will be free from not to live under Swedish law, but will be handled under American law if they commit any crimes, and that we will not really have any control over what is happening at their military bases. What is your impression or your opinion when you hear about this?
This sort of agreement was reached in the aftermath of World War II and the Korean War, particularly in the late 50s, early 60s, with several countries, because they felt that they were under existential threat from Soviet military power or, at the time, a repetition of Chinese communist military power in Korea. The Japanese, of course, were an occupied nation. They didn't have much say at the time. That was also true for the Germans. And these agreements are really very, very intrusive, as you point out. I am someone who thinks that they are, on the whole, outmoded and no longer relevant to the world we live in. Let me explain. If you look at the defense agreement that you've signed, you are now essentially hostage as a nation to whatever the United States does or does not do against almost any enemy anywhere, not just Russia, but potentially any adversary. If you read carefully, we have unobstructed access to all 17 bases. There's nothing in there that prevents us from bringing in nuclear weapons or any other advanced weapon system that we may develop in the meantime. This means that Sweden can be used as a launching pad for attack against Russia, or again, against anyone that the United States ends up in conflict with. This is not just a purely regional agreement that prefaces, or at least is predicated on the notion that you are attacked and then we come and help. The idea is that you now have a state of readiness in the United States Armed Forces that will be placed in your country that is ready to pull the trigger and go to war essentially without much consultation if any, against Russia. I would think this is a very dangerous document. If I were Swedish, I would not support it.
And so what you're saying is technically that if the Americans would enter a war with, say, Russia, and they would be sort of the aggressor, or they would do anything that means that the Article 5 of NATO is not fulfilled, that Sweden could technically still be used as an advance area or a base from where military strikes could be conducted against the enemy, even if we technically are not part as a nation in this conflict.
Yes, as I said before, the model for these agreements was really, or were really, the treaties that we reached with Germany and Japan, who had lost a major war, had little ground to stand on, and essentially signed pretty much whatever we put in front of them. I don't understand why Sweden or Finland or Norway or anybody else would want to do such a thing. There are all sorts of scenarios that could lead to conflict. You know, incidents inside the Arctic Circle, competition, conflict over access to resources, and then events that happen perhaps in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, or even in the Pacific that lead to a confrontation between the United States and Russia or China or someone else, and suddenly your bases are being used as a point of delivery for weapons of some kind, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, theater ballistic missiles, and so forth. You know, I don't understand it because I don't see an existential threat from Russia to Sweden. I think this is a huge lie. It's unnecessary. And if the Russians were genuinely interested in going to war with the West, they would already be sitting on the Polish border right now. And they're not, nor do they want a war with the West. That's something they don't even want to consider undertaking. They really want to get back to some sort of state of normalcy. They simply want Ukraine to be neutral. They don't want a state on their border that is armed to the teeth with weapons pointed at them. Sadly, we've tried to proliferate that problem. In other words, we are interested in provoking Russia, literally from Finland all the way to Armenia. This is catastrophically stupid and unnecessary, and that's something that the Swedes need to think about. I certainly would hope that your parliament would debate this matter very thoroughly before they effectively sign on for it. But I don't know what your law requires of Sweden.
Well, we're technically not very, we don't really know about it ourselves. We know that at least some left-leaning parties are opposed to this, and we also have a very dedicated, non-committed member of parliament, Elsa Widding, who's really taking the fight against this cooperation. But you have mentioned Japan and Germany, who were two nations that were defeated by the United States during the Second World War and were occupied afterwards. But if you compare this defense cooperation agreement, would you see these similarities with the other agreements with other nations, or is Sweden more like the one formed with Germany and Japan?
I think it is a modified version of what we've got in place with Germany and Japan and South Korea. And this means unobstructed access to bases, excuse me, at whatever point in time we decide to reinforce them. It doesn't prevent us from launching operations from your soil against Russia or anybody else that we decide we want to attack. I'm simply saying that, you know, your sovereignty is very much at risk. You think you have problems with the European Union, they shrink to almost insignificance to the problems that a treaty like this creates for you. And I don't understand this extreme sensitivity to what's happening in Russia. It looks like the lie machine, the fiction machine, has worked very effectively to convince everybody that Putin simply woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine, which is nonsense. We provoked him for years. Some people go back to 2008, to Bucharest, to the initial announcement by NATO that eventually Ukraine would join NATO. Well, I suppose so. I think you go back even further, but the point is you then get subsequently this coup in 2014, orchestrated, executed by the CIA, and the next thing you know, we are building Ukraine up into a significant military power, which is what we've done, pouring billions and billions of dollars into them for equipment, training, organization, and so forth. And now we've invested probably $100+ billion maybe 150 billion or more, in an attempt to effectively take on and destroy Russia. What's really amazing about events right now is that the Russians have exercised such tremendous restraint. I'm surprised that we've avoided war to this point with Russia.
I live by the principle that never try to see reason behind what the politicians are doing. You'll simply get disappointed every time. But it is a very, how to say, big change that this agreement will mean for the Swedish public, the Swedish security, and the Swedish geopolitics. The politicians have not bothered to have a referendum with asking the Swedish public what they think about this. They didn't do it with NATO as well. But now shouldn't these kind of big impacts be a referendum about them instead of just forcing them above the heads of the public?
Well, you are ruled by a class of people very similar to the people that rule us in Washington. Now, who are these people? Well, we call them globalists, neoconservatives. You can come up with any number of different terms, but they are people who think that they have a monopoly on wisdom, truth, and understanding, and that we are incapable of making decisions in our own interest. Hence, they seek to brush aside any democratic forum that might expose their agenda to public scrutiny. In other words, they try to use executive orders, edicts, in order to effectively remove from our populations, our electorates, the option of deciding something for themselves. This is a very anti-democratic, authoritarian class. As long as it rules in Europe and in the United States, we are going to remain at war with any number of different nations. We are going to remain in a posture where we cannot even defend ourselves, where we're not allowed to defend our borders, where we're not allowed to make decisions about who can enter our countries, who can live in our countries, and how people that come into our countries and refuse to leave, who are not citizens, should be treated. In effect, we've lost control of our lives to this ruling class. So the ruling class, to be blunt with you, needs to be removed. Now, it would be nice to do that at the ballot box. I don't know if that's going to work. I sincerely hope so. I know there's a substantial effort in the United States to do that. We shall see whether or not it actually works. We would prefer it that way. But the bottom line is we're dealing with a class that is very focused on themselves and on their donors, the people who donate to their political campaigns, the people who can enrich them and make them millionaires. They all want to be winners. What happens to the rest of us is irrelevant.
From what I've heard, these military bases, they will not just be these small areas with the trucks and where the soldiers eat and sleep, but they will be very large areas encompassing very large areas of soil and land surrounding the bases. If you look at the other defense cooperation agreements in other countries, what rights do landowners have if their lands fall within the designated areas of the military bases? And what happens if their rights collide with the military interests of the United States?
Well, before 1992 in Germany and certainly in places like Japan, specifically Okinawa, and also in Korea, vast areas were subject to military control for the purpose of conducting maneuvers and exercises. And in those maneuvers and exercises, we frequently damaged property. Now, there was a process in place that compensated landowners for the damage that we did. This was certainly true in Germany. My personal experience with it was that it worked reasonably well, although I'm not sure you can always compensate the landowner for what happens based upon the centuries of investment that his family has made in the property. Now, this agreement undoubtedly will provide for some sort of compensation if that should occur. But if I were Swedish and genuinely concerned about the environment, and I was worried about my country in terms of what happens to the soil, as well as the air, the trees, the mineral deposits, and so forth, I think I would have real questions about the wisdom of letting a foreign army, even one that I theorize is friendly to me, entering the country and roaming freely within the bounds of any U.S. military-controlled area. But this is something that, again, has to be debated, and those tenets in that agreement need to be pulled out and examined carefully. Sweden's very attractive in many ways because you have these vast forests, areas where operations and exercises can be held, and that's appealing because it's become increasingly difficult in Central Europe, which is highly populated and increasingly urbanized, to conduct those maneuvers and operations. That's another reason why the U.S. military looked very favorably on Poland, because as you go east in Poland, you have open rolling terrain, hills, forests, and so forth. And these can accommodate large exercises and maneuvers. The question is, how much of this do you want? How often do you want it? And what are the implications for Sweden and its existence as a state, its sovereignty, if you simply sign off, as apparently somebody has? I presume it was your defense minister. I can't answer all of those questions, but I'm trying to at least indicate to you that if I were in your position, I would raise serious questions. And that's not because I'm disloyal to my country. I love my country. I simply see no benefit in the current age for us to have large numbers of forces overseas on other people's soil. I certainly see no benefit to putting nuclear weapons in close proximity to Russia. We live in a world today where nuclear weapons can be delivered from the sea, from the air, from any number of different places at great distance from where you are. The notion that we should put a nuclear weapon in Finland or Sweden makes no sense to me at all. And I think if General Eisenhower were here, who was president in the 1950s, he would say, this is ridiculous. What do we do if the nuclear weapons are overrun by the opponent? So he was a staunch opponent of the idea of putting lots of nuclear weapons in Europe, period. He thought in terms of either at sea or perhaps someplace in North Africa, on the periphery of Europe, but not in Europe itself. Now, we made exceptions to that rule because we felt that we had no choice because we could not match Soviet conventional military power. Well, I think the concern now is that we will not be able to match Russian conventional military power either. Now, that presupposes that the Russians have any interest in marching over Finland and into Sweden. I see none. But, these are military considerations that you have to confront.
And it's very interesting that you touch upon the topic of nuclear weapons. The biggest fear among the Swedish public and also by the critical politicians is the risk that we will have nuclear weapons stored at these military bases. What are the risks that the Americans will transport nuclear weapons and have them stationed here at the military bases, considering that we don't have any clause against it? It doesn't mention nuclear weapons in this agreement. They say it is not necessary. The Americans have not requested it. But what are the risks that the Americans will still do it? And since
you and I do not know what sort of secret agreements have been reached that are not public, that are attachments to the current treaty that has been signed or agreement that has been signed. So we don't know. But if you're going to open the numbers of bases that you mentioned, and you're going to allow our ships into your waters, and you're going to allow our aircraft to land and take off from air bases, you effectively have surrendered control over what comes in and goes out. You have no way of knowing if nuclear weapons are brought in, are suddenly, warheads are suddenly mounted on missiles that previously had conventional warheads. And then an announcement is made that Sweden and Finland, for instance, have these weapons that are aimed at Russia because someone decides that it's necessary to intimidate Russia, which I think is pure folly and stupidity. But I'm just, I'm giving you a theoretical situation. And there you sit, the Swedish government has no effective control whatsoever. I mean, we do still have some nuclear warheads on the ground in Turkey. And I know that there are a lot of people concerned about that, both in the United States and Turkey. The point is that we live in a different world now. We are in the age of hypersonic missiles. We don't need to have weapons that are weapons of mass destruction in close proximity to any potential opponent. We can simply change the targeting, and we can launch weapons from sea, from the continental United States, from the air. But I would, as a Swede, I would want to look into that. I would want to know what is not public and find out what's in it. And again, I would debate this thing immediately in the open and really question the rationale for it. I mean, how many armies or Russian navies or air forces are sitting on your border poised to invade or strike you? I don't think there are any. On the other hand, if you're sitting in Moscow and you watch what we are doing with these agreements, then you may reconsider and decide, well, it looks as though we're going to have to target Finland and Sweden and Norway after all. If you're a Russian, we didn't plan on it. We don't want to do that. But if they're going to maintain this hostile posture towards us, then we have no choice. Again, I think it's time to think through all of this. This is not 1900. It's not 1950. It's 2024. Technology has raced ahead faster than we can absorb it, understand it, grasp it. It's time to think differently about warfare in general and the utility of these agreements. I really do. I think it has to be re-examined. I hope you will do that.
So technically, Russia will have to interpret Sweden and Finland like Schrodinger's cat when it comes to nuclear weapons. The cat could be dead or it could be alive. Like Sweden could have nuclear weapons and it could not have nuclear weapons. But they have to act like Sweden has nuclear weapons because it's not clear whether or not we have it or not.
Well, that's right. And again, you were neutral for many years, much like Austria and Switzerland. And the Russians did not view those countries that were neutral as necessarily inherently hostile, certainly not after 1992. All of a sudden, the whole strategic calculus is changing. The other thing to keep in mind is the rest of the world does not view things in Ukraine the way the Swedish government does. In other words, if I were to begin the process of putting together the numbers of countries who support Russia's position versus the Ukrainian position, I think I could find somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80 countries that absolutely agree with Moscow and understand why it invaded, because it felt compelled to do so for its own national security, as opposed to the few in the West, in Europe and the United States, North America, Australia, who keep insisting that this was a quote unquote unprovoked attack. That's a lot of nonsense. It was not. It was definitely provoked, and we continue to provoke, which is another reason I would re-examine this agreement if I were a Swede. Do you want to be tied to a major military power that is 5,000 to 6,000 miles away that insists on provoking Russia and China, Iran, and any number of other countries? Is that what you want? No, or do you want your freedom of maneuver? Do you want to be sovereign? Do you want to make your own decisions? Do you want the freedom to say, no, thank you, I'm not joining the alliance? I mean, what is it that you want to do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that's a question that should be more public to the Swedish public, instead of just being debated among the critics and the politicians ignoring it and claiming that NATO and the United States is the only safe option for us. But let's say that they transport nuclear warheads to Sweden. We have nuclear weapons here. And in case the Swedish government would be aware of this, who would still be in control of the nuclear weapon codes?
Washington, without question. The notion that you would have veto power over anything that we might do on your national soil is ludicrous. I mean, that's just not going to work. As soon as you agree to allow a foreign army to march across your territory, you have already surrendered some portion of your sovereignty. Now, if you face unambiguously a common enemy, that was true during the Napoleonic Wars, when the Swedes joined with the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians, ultimately to drive out the French. That was certainly less the case during World War I, obviously. Your king sent his personal bodyguard to fight on the Eastern Front with the Germans against the Tsarist forces. But had no interest and would not, under any circumstances, fight against the Western powers. I think, you've got to sit down and understand the world is much smaller now, and decisions are made in seconds. Weapons are launched and reach their targets in minutes. So if you don't have control of what's on your soil, you're at very great risk, because you've essentially abdicated responsibility for your own national security to a foreign power. I sometimes say the sad truth is that the Europeans have been all too ready to transform themselves into tributary states of the greater American military empire. That's a serious mistake. Why would you do that?
That's a very good question. But another question that follows up on this, could this agreement and as well as the very aggressive and rapid expansion of NATO, especially in Northern Europe, be interpreted as a preparations for a major military conflict with Russia in Northern Europe or in Europe as a total?
Well, I think so. I think there are foolish people that think in those terms. But I would point out something. First of all, I personally don't think the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to survive. As it becomes increasingly clear that Russia has become, once again, at least one of the top 5, top 4 military powers in the world, and that NATO has failed miserably to stop, deter, halt, obstruct Russia's operations in Ukraine, people will begin to question the wisdom of joining an alliance that is so incompetent and ineffective. I think that's going to come out in the months and years ahead. I've often said that sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. I think NATO is a sacred cow that over the next few years will simply vanish. Nobody will talk about it anymore. And quite frankly, the problem with NATO is it's got, 32 members now? And everyone does unavoidably see the world differently. If you think anyone in France, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Albania, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, no one in these countries is interested in going to war in Ukraine. It's not going to happen. Do you really believe, under any circumstances, that any of them would come to your aid if you were in a war? Of course not. So what is this all about? This is a last-ditch effort by this ruling class to do 2 things. First of all, maintain conditions of conflict and hostility towards Russia, which they deem as indispensable to their continued political dominance. And then secondly, they are subjugating you to their will. All of these people in Stockholm, Brussels, London, Washington, Paris, Berlin, they are all united in a purpose to reshape Europe according to their views, their values, their principles. And I think most Europeans have figured out that they don't necessarily subscribe to these values. Swedes actually like Sweden. They want it to stay Swedish. The same thing is true in Norway, England, Scotland, Wales, but the governments don't care about that. Refashioning you into an amorphous mass of sedated consumers with no real national identity or purpose seems to be the end state, the goal. And hostility to Russia, which is fiercely nationalistic, which is determined to preserve its existence, its religion, its culture, its language, is obviously anathema to them. So what side do you really want to be on? You ought to be on Sweden's side. And where do Sweden's interests lie? Do they lie with this, in my view, self-destructive alliance? Or do they lie elsewhere? So that's a question you've got to answer.
It definitely lies with Scandinavia and the other Nordic countries, at least. But this agreement will run for at least 10 years. And let's say that we get a more, say, pro-Swedish government in that time that doesn't want to cater for this United States military. Would they be able to cancel the agreement if possible? If we say that these 10 years pass and they say, no, we don't want to resume this agreement, Would the Yankees, the Americans, be willing to just pack up and leave, or would there be a risk that they would use their military strength, their boots on the ground, to force themselves to stay?
Well, in theory, yes. You could pull the plug on this, as we say in English. But in reality, it would be difficult. It would be problematic. It would be expensive and time-consuming. And I would imagine that the worst time to make such a decision would be in the middle of a crisis involving the United States and another power like Russia, which is why I would caution against doing any of it to begin with. So, you know, in the final analysis, when you admit these forces, you open these bases, you bring in the aircraft, you allow the ships to come in, everything does change rather dramatically. And reversing that will not happen overnight. It will take time. And in that space of that time, bad things could happen. You know, one of the things that a lot of us thought in the early 1990s, I'm talking about those officers that served with me in NATO, we believed strongly that NATO really existed after 1992 to prevent the outbreak of another war on European soil. Everyone felt that, you know, Europe had had enough wars as it is and didn't need any more. So we did not view the Russians or the Ukrainians or anybody else as the enemy. We thought NATO was a good way to prevent that. We turned out to be wrong. We were wrong in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We were wrong in Kosovo. And we are wrong again right now in this incredibly dangerous and pointless hatred and hostility towards Russia. Again, this is the ruling class that you're dealing with, this globalist neocon ruling class. They have all the answers. You have none. You're obligated to obey. Shut up and do what you're told. And that includes everything from vaccinations to nuclear weapons. Yeah. I wouldn't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in it now.
As well as a lot of other questions here in Sweden, in the United States, and overall in Europe. But I've also heard claims, I don't know if they are true or not, but I've heard that the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Floyd Austin, has not taken the oath that is required of an American official. Do you know if that's true or not? And if it is true, would that make the agreement valid if he has not taken the oath and then signed this agreement?
You know, I'm not able to answer that. I did not know that, and I have not heard that. It seems inconceivable to me that he has not taken the oath of office. So that's a matter that I just can't discuss because I know absolutely nothing about it. If that were the case, that's the first time in history that somebody has risen to that level and not taken that oath. That's beyond my comprehension.
It's a very good, honest answer, definitely. So it's very great that you're open with that. You haven't heard about it, and I don't know myself if it's true or not. But I've heard a lot of claims from a lot of people, both here in Sweden and in the United States. So I really wanted to hear your opinion and if you had heard about it. But to wrap this interview up, I would like to to question you to mention this quotation that is attributed to Mr. Henry Kissinger. To be an enemy of America can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. If you look at this comment in relation to this Swedish agreement, the agreement between Sweden and the United States, would you say it's true, this comment?
You know, I think he's making a point that is certainly valid. He was thinking at the time of South Vietnam, the Republic of South Vietnam, that ultimately was completely destroyed. We went into a country for one set of reasons that made no sense and discovered we were really involving ourselves in a civil war. And it was a mistake. And we killed 2 million people in the process for nothing. So I think that was on his mind. But he makes an important point. And I've said this before in other interviews. In the 1960s, when Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from the military structure of NATO, in other words, he remained a member of the alliance, but wanted nothing to do with U.S. and foreign forces on French soil. And he made that very clear. He said, Europeans need to understand that Britain is an island and Americans do not live in Europe. I mean, his point was very well taken. We don't live there. We are on the other side of the world, and very few Americans give a lot of thought to what we are discussing here today. Americans have trusted too readily their representatives to make good decisions on their behalf. People are now beginning to wake up and question what they've been doing for a whole range of reasons. But why would you want to place the destiny of Sweden in the hands of somebody sitting in Washington? Shouldn't that decision be in the hands of the Swedish king or prime minister or whatever you want to name in Sweden? I certainly would. And the assumption was in the past, well, if I don't have forces on the ground now, I'm, vulnerable to a sudden invasion. Well, those days are over. There's no such thing as a sudden invasion. We can spot forces when they mobilize. We can see them concentrate. We can see them move. So the notion that you're going to be suddenly surprised in that way is ludicrous. What is also true is that you may or may not have enough warning in the event that a nuclear armed missile heads in your direction. And quite frankly, we've looked at what could happen in a nuclear exchange between, say, Russia and the United States, and we've concluded that in the first hour, 90 million Americans would die. It's absurd. Now, I don't know how many Russians would die, but I would be surprised if it were not a similar number. What is the point? That makes no sense. Why would you want to be dependent upon that kind of insanity? I would not.
Yeah, we don't, and most of us don't want to be. But unfortunately, our politicians have decided on something completely different. And what we're trying to do now is to bring up this to the public and inform them about the risks that this agreement means to them. I really want to thank you, Colonel Macgregor, for taking the time being with us here today and explaining and giving your opinion on this defense cooperation agreement. Are there any last words of wisdom that you want to share with us before we depart?
Every nation develops a strategy at some point for its own security. That's economic, as well as political, diplomatic, and military. Your first and foremost consideration, and our first and foremost consideration, must be the same: the survival of the state, the survival of the Swedish state, and the population it exists to protect. That's number one. I don't think making you hostage to our interests, nor do I think it makes sense for us to be hostage to your interests when it comes to military power and military conflict and military engagement in the modern world. It's dangerous. We should have mutual respect for the way we do business, the way we see each other, even though we may not see each other the same way all the time. And we should be preoccupied with avoiding conflict, not provoking it. Unfortunately, right now, this government in Washington is very provocative. Something for you in Sweden to think about.
It really is. Thank you very much, Colonel, for being with us here today. And thank you very much for sharing your experience and your knowledge in this very, I would say, firing, burning situation that we are here in Sweden today. I don't know when the parliament will vote about it, but I've heard both in May, sometime in June, at some point at least, the government and the politicians will vote about it and whether or not to agree upon this agreement. So I really hope that we will be able to change the tides before that. So thank you very much.
I certainly hope so. I wish you all the best.
Yeah, and we wish you all the luck over in the United States as well at the same time. Let's see here.
Okay. All right.
I hope to hear from you again and that you will be able to join us for another interview in the future. So thank you very much, sir, and good luck and good day.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.